I think the
Hmm.
larger conversation that I wanted to bring forward with this book is quite simply this. Look, in nature, every instance where one species completely dominates everything else, they
Hmm.
inadvertently destroy whatever it is that they're dominating.
Yeah. Hmm.
And we need to recognize that. So maybe things that we look at that we consider to be set in stone, like our dominion over nature, should be
Hmm.
reevaluated to something more of a stewardship or
Hmm.
a guardianship, or at least a very basic understanding that this world is the only habitat we have and it's
Hmm.
interconnected. And
Hmm.
it may seem like the piece of plastic that you tear off the candy bar, right, and throw into the garbage isn't going to have any major impact, but it literally does because now
Hmm.
we have a huge garbage island, right,
Hmm.
floating in the Pacific.
Hello and welcome to the podcast Homespun Script. I'm your host, Nate Knispel. My guest today is Raphael Hernandez, author of the novel The Cemi and the Legends of the Taino, which weaves together two separate narratives. The first follows a family from Chicago visiting their grandmother in Puerto Rico. During their stay, they explore their grandmother's finca, or farm, witnessing the cultivation of yuca and coffee, the unique geography of the area, and the associated changes the modern world has introduced. During a stormy night and the subsequent loss of electricity, their grandmother, Dona Maria, along with their other family friends, share stories of Taino mythology with their children. Alexandra, a teenage girl with a focused interest in anthropology, takes particular interest in these tales. The second narrative consists of a retelling of fragments of Taino mythology from the Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico, each linked with a particular experience of the visiting family. Here's Raphael reading from the novel.
No viene un huracán, right, abuela? Said Alex. No, mija. Just a storm, said Dona Maria. Too bad we can't ask Guatauba to calm the tempest, she said with a smile. Who? Asked Jose. The little boy had also become a bit frightened, and he inched his way closer as the sky grew an ominous gray. She could see in his eyes there was a worry. But true to the nature of little boys, his curiosity won. Guatauba? Asked Maria. Si, said the little boy. Guatauba was a great warrior who encountered Huracán and discovered the being behind the storms, said Dona Maria. The tempest outside, as if reacting to the name Guatauba, howled. She's talking about Puerto Rican wrestling on TV. Huracán is a wrestler's name, so is Guatauba, said Alexandra. Right, abuela? She added, seeking confirmation. No, mija, said Maria with a smile, but close. Guatauba was a Taino. Huracán was a spirit that controlled the storms and sent the huracán. For real? Asked Jose, abandoning his exploration for the allure of an exciting story. How? Alexandra, who had been dividing her time between her phone and the storm, looked at her grandmother. There was a pause as the teenager processed information that made no sense to her in her young view of the world. ¿Cómo? She said almost immediately, setting her phone down next to her plush couch. Well, let's see, began Dona Maria.
Raphael, that was wonderful. Thank you. Welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure and privilege to talk with you.
Glad to be here.
Cool. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I was born in Chicago, and then around the age of 11, I was able to move back to Puerto Rico with my father, who moved to a rural area called Naranjito. And we weren't living off of the land, but we were living in conjunction with the land. So we would supplement, whatever we would get from income with stuff that was already naturally growing there, like oranges, coffee, bananas, yuca. And so that at that age, it kind of created a unique perspective on how I view the natural world, which is a lot less in terms of like it's ours and much more, it gives us what we need if we take care of it, which is a common theme in both the Hibaro community and in the book that I wrote.
Cool. So you currently live in Chicago then, right?
Yes, so I live in
Okay.
Chicago,
Uh-huh.
and I had an accident, unfortunate accident, so I can't work anymore. So I've started writing,
Mm-hmm.
and not really, anything major, just sort of
Hmm.
books that on topics that I find interesting, and the mythology was one of them.
Hmm. Cool. So, you're going to have to forgive me on my pronunciation of some of the
No problem.
terminology here. All right. Yeah. I hate the fact that I'm most likely butchering it, but unfortunately, that's going to be the reality in this situation, and I fully take ownership of that.
That's okay.
So,
It's totally okay.
okay. So, how did your novel, The Cemi and the Legends of the Taino, come to be?
So, interestingly enough, I was thinking about this earlier. I don't know if the listeners are really aware of how much mythology has transitioned its way back into our collective
Hmm.
narrative. So
Hmm.
when I was growing up in the 80s, there was Thor, but it was contained to like comic books. There were other sort of mentions of these mythological figures, but they were also contained within comic books. And
Hmm.
as of recent, they've sort of hit mainstream. And I was at home watching a movie and wondering it'd be interesting to see what was out there about the mythology that I remembered,
Hmm.
which isn't a lot. And when I started looking, in fact, there wasn't. And so, inspired by that quote that I have at the end of my email, if
Hmm.
there's something that you want to read and it doesn't exist, then write it. I, you know,
Hmm.
did that very thing. Um,
Hmm.
and so I sat down and decided to at least get something where if the next generation were to ask, it wouldn't be a question mark. There would at least be something.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems. I remember we're about the same age, I think, and I remember the '80s as well, and the appropriation of mythology there. And I came from a background playing Dungeons and Dragons and looking at the deities and demigods book. Everything in there was all right. Let's see how cool of a fighter this certain character is, or what kind of neat weapon they have, and how badass they are. And it's refreshing to see. And even now, we see that as well with mythology being appropriated into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Thor and everything like that.
Yeah,
But
yeah, for sure.
mhm.
Go ahead.
It's refreshing. No, it's refreshing to see mythology being looked at in a different way outside of the sort of popular action culture that we have.
Right. And the interesting thing about that is our generation, right, had the opportunity to look at that in a way that wasn't sort of seen as this like, oh, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like, I
Hmm.
don't believe that, in the 60s and 70s, the emphasis on mythological figures would have been so accepted
Hmm.
as it has been in the recent 90s, 2000.
Hmm.
And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of explore other cultures. I mean,
Hmm.
cool stuff is cool stuff in any language. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, yeah, and even the way it's not only cool stuff, but we also look at the way in which this mythological backdrop has informed the way we think about things, and sort of without even knowing it at times. Because you
correct.
mentioned
Yes.
that a lot of the mythology you're dealing with, um, I don't want to say it's forgotten because you obviously found it, but it's not ready to hand. It's not right there in front of us. And yeah, the way you articulated it and presented it in this book is in a really interesting way. To how I'm sorry, I can't talk either
It's
sometimes.
okay.
But yeah, you did that in a really interesting way. So that was your motivation behind that. But could you maybe give us a little bit of a backdrop of the Taino mythology that you're working with? Because I'm guessing most of our listeners are not the least bit familiar with it, or very minimally familiar with it.
Sure. So I want to make this absolutely clear that I do not hold any academic accreditation in either theology, religious studies, any type of
Hmm.
rigorous historiography. And in fact, in the book, I try to avoid any type of claims as to culture or history of the Taino people specifically themselves. Having said that, I was able to look at other cultures that were very similar in sort of geographic area. What we know of the Arawak, what we know of the Mayan and surrounding cultures, what we know of Native American tribes here, and also remarkably what we understand of sort of these animistic cultures in the Far East. Right. One of the things that I found remarkable was that the in the Caribbean we have the Cemi, which
Hmm.
are spirits that are attributed to naturally occurring phenomenon or events, in a
Hmm.
manner of speaking. And again, that's my unacademic definition.
Hmm.
And you find similar events of that all over the world. So, like the kami in Japan, right? The spirits here with the Native American culture. So,
Hmm.
I think that they're interesting sort of tapestries that allow a lot of opportunity to explore.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I hesitate. I think the popular word that's used for that sort of thing is animism. And I'm not a fan of that label
Right.
because the
Yeah.
connotations indicate it's like some sort of um, primitive shamanism. And that's
Right.
very much
Correct.
not the case. Yeah.
Right. And the interesting thing is that because there's so little record left, it would be really, really hard to determine whether they were or not. Now we
Hmm.
can make some kinds of inferments. They did respect the natural world. That's
Hmm.
absolutely clear. And they did feel that the natural world, there was a sort of dual layer to the natural world, one being
Hmm.
the physical materium that we interact with every day, and the second being the spiritual or the immaterium that we interact with every day for them at least, but in a different
Hmm.
way.
Right.
And so one of the things that they did was to give that a name or a label, and they came up with Cemi.
Hmm.
Um, I think that it's just something that most cultures have done, that sort of ascribe names and personalities to naturally occurring events.
Hmm.
Uh,
Sure.
and like I said, I think from there we can pull some lessons, which is how we look at ourselves in
Hmm.
terms of nature, right? Like the fact that the Taino within the book um, seek to more work with the Semi in a greater understanding of what's
Hmm.
happening, as opposed to resisting this guidance that they're being offered, really speaks to us as a culture. Like I feel that oftentimes Westerners become dismissive of other forms of thought if it's not parsed in a Western way. And I
Hmm.
think one of the things that mythology does is it creates this sort of bridge between, because we all have it, right? So then we
Hmm.
can all share stories about it.
Hmm.
And so those are primarily the driving, the aspects of it. In terms of specificity, like we have the names, we have Juracong, and we have Guatabauba,
Hmm.
and some of the names I had to construct, right?
Oh,
Which
okay.
was Atahua, which is sort of a
Hmm.
derivative from like, it's sort of Arawak sounding, but
Okay.
it's not anything that I found.
Hmm.
And that's, the unfortunate tragedy of the story, is that a lot of it's missing.
Hmm.
Instead of looking at the tapestry in tattered pieces, however, I thought it'd be interesting to reconstruct it with a bit of fiction, so that
Hmm.
at least there's something to look at. You may not like it, but
Hmm.
there's something to look at.
Hmm. Well, yeah, filling in the blanks. And, the mythology, it has been created at some point. And so claiming that there's some sort of really essential or immutably true essence to each of these stories, I think might be maybe erring a little bit. And so filling in the blanks and constructing our own narrative seems a perfectly legitimate way of going about things. Yeah.
Right. Hmm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So, yeah, you've done a good bit of research into this. How did you go about engaging in this research? What kind of written
So
records do you have? Where did you find all this stuff?
yeah, so a lot of this just came from high school. And
Uh-huh.
so I don't know what the curriculum is like now, but I know that when I was there in high school, all 3 years there was a Taino component to all of our history lessons,
Hmm.
where we talked about like their culture, we talked
Hmm.
about the history, we talked about their religious beliefs. Uh,
Hmm.
those, I mean, they were very informative as far as like what Atabe was actually like, what
Hmm.
Guatabauba was actually like, anybody's guess.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so I just decided to throw my hat in the ring and make the best educated guess that would be sort of
Hmm.
engaging. Now, there are stories that are definitely connected. So at
Hmm.
some point in time in the mythology, Atabe does banish Yukachu to a
Hmm.
cave,
Yeah.
but the fragment was so broken up that it really it was more like something you would say in passing during a campfire. If
Hmm.
someone else had said, maybe if like a friend of yours had given a story about the Naga, and
Hmm.
and you're wanting to relate your mythology, that would be the fragment that you would have. At some point in
Yeah.
time, she banished him for being, imprudent to a cave.
Hmm.
Other than that,
Hmm.
and I don't know, that kind of just didn't, I don't know, it didn't seem, um, it seemed like we could do more.
Sure. Well, and the way that the story, or at least that fragment of the story, might impact our understanding of our relationship with the natural world is going to change with the advent of modern society. And so, filling in
Hmm.
those blanks and infusing it with more meaning seems a perfectly logical thing to do to me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let's talk about the novel a little bit more. So you've constructed this as two intertwined narratives, and it looks as though it provides a fantastic backdrop for looking at the modern world through kind of a mythological lens. And let's look at the scene that you read from, where Alexandra is talking about what's could you pronounce that name?
Yeah. It's Yuracon. Yuracon.
Oh, Yerako. Okay. Hirako, and they're talking about two different things there. She thinks she's talking about a wrestler, and the grandmother is talking about something very different. Yeah, maybe explain that
Yes.
scene for us a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, because
So I
it
want.
sets the stage really
Yeah.
well.
So I want to say that one of my favorite stories is 1001 Arabian Nights. And
Hmm.
it's because it uses this literary mechanism to sort of provide you with a story inside of a story. And so
Hmm.
the first story is essentially a family from Chicago that travels to Puerto Rico and meets the grandmother. And then the grandmother is sort of telling them about herself and how she lives and how the people in the area lived and how their ancestors lived. And the second story is actually her narrations, the grandmother's narrations to the children and the mother about the Cemi. So the
Hmm.
scene that I read from, the power goes out, as you know happens in Puerto Rico often,
Hmm.
and especially when there's a storm. And the grandmother makes the comment of, "I wish maybe we could call Yuracon to come scare away the storm or drive away the storm."
Hmm.
And the granddaughter, Alexandra, sort of playing on her phone, hears Jose go, "Who's that?" And Alexandra, of course, becomes like, "What do you mean? That's a wrestler." And gets
Hmm.
and actually says, "That's a wrestler." And then looks to her grandmother to confirm. And the grandmother says, "No, it's in fact not a wrestler. It's the name of the storm."
Hmm.
So the interesting thing about that passage is that it's the intersection of all three experiences. It's the child will say not knowing what's going on and looking for the adults for sort of guidance. The teen who steps in through the eyes of the modern world, who ascribes to it a perfectly reasonable, right,
Hmm.
um, definition, which is he's a wrestler. He's got to be a wrestler. And then the grandmother saying, actually, no, this is a semi, this is what the Cemi did, and this is what the Cemi represented for the Taino people.
Hmm.
Um, and I feel that by using that, we can sort of get this conversation between the generations.
Hmm.
And this happens often where Alexandra at the beginning is very connected to her phone. Over time, she loses interest in her phone because she's captivated by this world that she sort of is unfolding in front of her, and then being able to ascribe that with a geographical space.
Hmm.
So it's not just this happened somewhere, like this could have happened right here on the property.
Hmm.
Um, I think that also really creates a really important connection. And
Hmm.
so when I was telling these stories, like specifically like the one about the moon, which is advocating on behalf of the plant, which is the Reina de la Noche, or the Queen of
Hmm.
the Night, right? The Queen of the Night is a plant in Puerto Rico that we have.
Hmm.
And I thought it would be interesting to tie the sort of Semi's concern with the natural world and how we view the natural world back into the choices that we make
Hmm.
and how they affect generations going down the line. So if
Hmm.
that particular cacique had decided to wipe out that plant, we
Hmm.
today wouldn't, and within the literary device, we wouldn't
Right.
have be able
Hmm.
to, we wouldn't be able to experience its beauty.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and that's sort of how it goes back and forth. And obviously, then you see how the grandmother lives rurally,
Hmm.
finding yuca, picking coffee, and then at the
Hmm.
same time, you saw how the Simi interacted with the Taino,
Hmm.
and hopefully, it provides a richer tapestry for what kind of conversations may have been going on, or
Hmm.
and more importantly, what kind of conversations we can have about how we see our world.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Let's circle back a little bit
Sure.
to this idea. You mentioned it earlier and you just mentioned it again, but it's a common theme throughout the book that the relationship that humanity has with the natural world is much different in the mythological backdrop than what we usually see in the West. And this goes back to, way hundreds of years. The starting point I usually take is with the British colonists and John Locke saying things like, well, we have a divine, us Europeans have a divine right to own the land and cultivate it in as very efficient way possible, or as efficient a way as we possibly can. And that conception of efficiency and this conception of the relationship between humanity and the natural world is one of humanity having the only agency and the natural world being merely an object for consumption. And several times in this book, the mythological backdrop that you have presents something very different. And with the plant that flowers only in the night, that segue brought it out. And the other one I thought that really brought it out well, and this might be a little bit too obvious at my part, but it's brought out a lot. But the one with the two sisters.
Yes, that's exactly, yes.
Okay. Take it away. I want you to
Yeah.
explain it, not me.
So one of the themes that I found interesting throughout a lot of these different mythologies that's really not touched on is that the mythologies that even the Western ones, even the Greek and the Roman and the Norse, human beings are still somewhat beholden to the environment.
Very good point. Very good point.
So we can't really go ape, blank
Yep.
on a forest because there are deities that are associated with that forest that will then protect that forest.
Yeah.
I think that the West, because of how we view things, we no longer see any reason for us to not be able to do that. And if you can't do something and it provides an immediate benefit,
right,
then why wouldn't you? I think the larger conversation that I wanted to bring forward with this book is quite simply this. Look, in nature, every instance where one species completely dominates everything else, they inadvertently destroy whatever it is that they're dominating.
Yep.
And we need to recognize that. So maybe things that we look at that we consider to be set in stone, like our dominion over nature, should be reevaluated to something more of a stewardship or a guardianship, or at least a very basic understanding that this world is the only habitat we have and it's interconnected. And it may seem like the piece of plastic that you tear off the candy bar, right, and throw into the garbage isn't going to have any major impact, but it literally does, because now we have a huge garbage island, right, floating in the Pacific. So I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of looking at who we are as a species and what our role is within the larger web. But I think that it's really important that we have a conversation regarding what our role is, because the reality is if we wreck Earth, there is no other one that we're aware of and can reach.
Yeah. I've heard that phrase kind of turned on its head. And in the end, the Earth, the planet will most likely be just fine. But it just won't be, it's us that won't be fine because we won't be able to inhabit the planet anymore.
Right. And one of the reasons, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I write about is how you cannot look at sort of these endeavors that happen in terms of time. It has to be over terms of generations. And so if we do something that causes a catastrophic environmental collapse, and in 5 billion years, right, a new sentient species comes about, right, the Earth will in fact go on, and maybe they'll be able to get it right. But the reality is that all of our accomplishments and achievements and wonderful, art and philosophy, that's going to be gone unless they find it in some kind of archive that can survive, the eons that it takes evolutionary processes.
Right.
I think it would be much smarter for us to figure out how to maintain the planet as a viable living option indefinitely. And that, of course, comes with a reevaluation of how we see ourselves in nature.
Yeah, that was definitely the point I got from the little from the sequence with the two sisters. Maybe explain what that sequence is, just so we have a reference point.
Sure. Yeah. So it's one of the things that I think is a common theme in any culture, which is the
Yeah.
theme of expansion vis-a-vis environmental concern.
Mm-hmm.
As a species, as a member species of this planet, I believe that we have the right to be able to go out and acquire a certain amount of resources.
Mm-hmm.
When does that transgress into excess? And when do we
Mm-hmm.
start saying this excess is damaging?
Mm-hmm.
And in the story, I use the device of the Cemi, which are
Mm-hmm.
sacred caves, and a tree that is planted in front of the cave. And then
Mm-hmm.
as the Taino pass on to the next life, they pass by this cave, which is to remind them that this is the end of life. Like you can lay all your
Mm-hmm.
burdens down at this tree because now you can go on to the next realm. And one of the sisters in the novel decides to go there and start cultivating in a
Mm-hmm.
very destructive way. And
Mm-hmm.
there are consequences to that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this is to go back to what we were talking about. These are the physical consequences for destroying because there was an entity that manifested itself to carry out these consequences,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, important for us because we don't have any entity that's holding us accountable. We're just going to keep burning the earth until there's nothing left. And then we're going to
Mm-hmm.
cross that threshold. And I'm hoping that this book will sort of create an artificial Cemi to say,
Mm-hmm.
look at what you're doing. Like, this is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
This goes beyond any type of like philosophical or, this is like literally you're setting your house on fire and then sitting
Right.
in the center of the room.
Yeah. It's very practical, direct, and interfaces right now. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm continually surprised at the mentality. I'm just going to call it the mentality of the cultivator, because you refer to the sister who cultivates as, not just her name, but the cultivator, which I thought was very telling. But yeah.
Yeah,
What was
and the
what?
reality is that the
Yeah.
Taino were very much an agrarian society that valued, hard work and agrarianism and
Mm-hmm.
diplomacy and trade, and they valued all the things that we valued. They also understood, though, that if you cut all the trees down, right, and it rains,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be
Yeah.
problems. They might not have
Yeah.
had the scientific
Mm-hmm.
terminology that we can ascribe to those phenomenons, but they at
Mm-hmm.
least understood that excessive
Mm-hmm.
consumption is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
a reasonable conclusion for any culture to make.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So, what was your favorite mythological sequence to write about in the book, and why? There's some, I think there were like 9 or 10 of them, something like that. I wasn't
Yeah,
counting, but it's
yeah,
around there. Yeah.
yeah. So I have a couple. I really like the Atabe creation story. So
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed writing that,
Mm-hmm.
particularly because I wanted to show that, like, and I'm not sure if you sort of picked up on this theme, but all of the Semi speak of this time where it's our turn to take over the mantle of stewardship, and they have to
Mm-hmm.
leave.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that they do within the book relates to that. Everything that they try to
Mm-hmm.
teach us, everything that they try to show us, all the acts that they do on our behalf are all done with the goal in mind that this is your, after a point, this is your world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that sequence was very powerful, and then obviously the sisters was a really good way of me being able to
Mm-hmm.
sort of converse about the things that I'm
Okay.
concerned about.
Yeah, and the first one you mentioned with Atabaya, that's with her son who plays the joke on everybody and gets
Yeah, so
banished.
that would be my third favorite. The
Oh,
first one
okay.
was Atabe actually coming to the island of Borinquen and create a
Oh, right. Yeah, the
flower that
potato.
was
Yeah.
in the memory. Yeah, yes. So she creates this flower that unfortunately perished on another world. And so she
Hmm.
brings that memory with her here. And so she sort of uses the idea of that flower to inspire a flower that's native to the island,
Hmm.
sort of showing a sort of a larger cosmology um,
Okay.
to sort of this mythology.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then the cave, of course, he spitting out fireflies kind of came to me
Yeah.
as I was walking, walking
It's time to
outside.
take
These
things
bugs are everywhere.
seriously.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I saw a
Yeah.
couple layers of meaning on that one as well. I didn't really see them initially, but after reading the rest of the book, I'm like, okay, there's maybe I should go back and read that one. And yeah, I didn't have time to reread it, but I will at some point. I really enjoyed the final sequence. I don't know if I don't want to be giving away too many spoilers here, but you mentioned before that the narrative with the family from Chicago, the daughter, the teenager Alexandra, she's always on her phone, and then it's revealed that she has an interest in anthropology, and she starts listening to all the stories, and she decides, okay, I have an interest in anthropology, and there's this internship, and at where I can't remember where the internship was, but
University of Chicago.
it was University of Chicago.
Yes.
Okay, but with maybe developing and preserving this mythological narrative. And so after a while, she's not on her phone at all. And the parallel between the final mythological sequence that you have and what happens with Alexandra, I would guess maybe 15 years in the future, something like that.
Yes.
Because at this point, she's grown up and she's a teacher of some sort. And is it okay to talk about this sequence? Because
So
it's right at the end.
yeah, I can talk about it. The
Okay.
idea behind that final sequence was the reality that every generation has to pass the torch.
Hmm.
And the more equitable and graceful that transition can be, I always find that it the sooner that the preceding generation recognizes the generation behind it as a valid generation that can
Hmm.
continue us in a successful way, I think um, it's part of growing up
Hmm.
is the day that you have to step into your guardian's shoes and become the guardian.
Hmm.
And I think that I wanted to make sure that the reader understood that our ancestors are never really gone.
Right.
They're sort of with us,
Hmm.
and they worked their entire lives to
Hmm.
culminate in us. And so maintaining that connection to the past and
Hmm.
that reverence to the past can give us a lot of insight into the future,
Hmm.
and really define who we are as
Hmm.
a species. Are we a species that learns,
Hmm.
or do we just sort of side on the side with being cavalier in everything?
Hmm. Yeah. It one thing that it had an impact on me in a couple different ways as well. First off, because it looks like Alexandra, who is now, I don't want to say thoroughly embroiled in the modern world, but she's definitely part of the modern world more than her grandmother was, and she takes on the mantle of preserving this mythology and these stories and this way of thinking, but it's not within the rural kind of agrarian context that her grandmother was in, but she's in Chicago. She's a professor, and this is kind of one way of preserving this. I don't want to say ideology, but one way of preserving this mythology, and it's in a different way, and it's adapting to the modern world in a very
Right, and I
effective.
think I think that there are many paths to stewardship, and I think each generation has to choose how they enact their conservation. The
Hmm.
important thing is that conservation happens, and that we don't
Yeah.
just blaze ahead without consideration to the planet and the
Hmm.
damage and wonders that we can bring about by the choices that we make, because that's what it's really
Hmm.
all about. Throughout the entire book, the book is really about the choices that we make
Hmm.
and how they impact, right, the world
Hmm.
around us, which is, I
Hmm.
think, is a valid theme in any civilization or
Hmm.
mythology.
Yeah. Yeah. And the mythological sequence that you had running parallel to this transition from Dona Maria to Alexandra worked perfectly. Yeah. It was really good.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you.
yeah. So I don't want to give too much about give away too much about that novel. I encourage everyone to read it. I loved it. But so you've got a couple other things on the back burner, right? You told me that you have an upcoming work that you described as a cyberpunk comedy. That sounds like a bit of a
Yes.
change, a bit of a
Yeah.
pivot. What can we expect here?
Yeah. So this last book was kind of a way of me, um, you know, uh, wanting to make a record for the community in terms of mythology.
Hmm.
The cyberpunk novel is really, it's written in a way that it could be anyone. Any one of us knows a person like the protagonist. The
Okay.
protagonist doesn't have a name, doesn't have a gender.
Hmm.
It's first person,
Hmm.
and this person has gone completely down the rabbit hole.
Hmm.
Now, for all intents and purposes, they live in a utopian society.
Hmm.
But because they've so heavily bought into and invested this cyberpunk this dystopia, they
Hmm.
sort of see all of these things that the world is providing, such as universal health care, universal free education, um, minimum basic income, the restitution of the environment, the healing of the environment, the elimination of large scale conflict globally. He
Hmm.
sees this as the carrots to keep us complacent and docile.
Oh, interesting.
And he sets about
Uh,
on a quest to prove that, in fact, all of the rhetoric that the good people in the government are giving you is a lie. And they're
hmm.
actually just doing the exact same thing. It's just that we're more present to it, which is, in fact, not correct.
Hmm.
And then he has this sort of, or the protagonist, because it doesn't have a gender, the protagonist has a robot, which is named Watson. And
Hmm.
Watson is a wellness and therapeutic systems operant
Hmm.
node.
Hmm.
And Watson provides the voice of reason. So when
Okay.
the protagonist says things like, oh, that person is wearing a hoodie from North Dakota, North Dakota doesn't exist,
Hmm.
and I don't trust people who come from there, Watson then can step in and go, wait a minute, that's an actual conspiracy theory I've heard before,
Hmm.
that North Dakota doesn't exist, and that it's a conspiracy by the government
Hmm.
um, to have sort of these facilities there for, the post-apocalyptic
Oh, right.
reconstruction of the United States.
North Dakota makes
Clearly
perfect
not
sense for that.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for the devices of the novel, right? So now
Uh,
anyone that he runs into that claims to be from North Dakota, he
hmm.
automatically assumes there's a secret agent out to get him with
Okay.
hysterical consequences.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's kind of an exploration of at what point do you stop going down the rabbit hole and go, wait a minute, I'm really making more of this than what it actually is.
Hmm.
And I think that's a conversation that's especially relevant today.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Sure.
he's very much a Quixotean figure, a sort of
Okay.
the
Uh,
narrative that he tells himself is disconnected from what's actually happening.
hmm.
But unlike Quixote, like the things that he's doing, the conspiracies that he's ascribing to, he's going and finding them in places that the rest of the world has defunct,
Hmm.
which is these old archaic sections of the internet where there's no
Okay.
one to moderate and be like, you can't do that, you can't say that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Which I think something that caused huge problems in 2016 and moving
Sure.
forward. Just misinformation is a huge problem
Yeah.
still today. I mean, so
Sure. Hmm. Hmm. Yep. We don't have to look very far than the current
right,
debate in the
exactly,
election right now to find a lot of that stuff, do we? Cool.
exactly.
Do we have a time frame on when that book is going to be finished or when it's going to be released?
Um, Probably about a year, because I
Okay.
like to really make sure that I write it in a way that if you pick it up, you won't side with anything in the society. You'll be very you'll feel sorry for the protagonist
Okay.
because the protagonist is living in a world that they're effectively constructing
Hmm.
and enabling themselves, despite
Yeah.
all of these mechanisms to sort of pull the protagonist out and allow
Hmm.
the protagonist to see,
Hmm.
like, we have universal healthcare, like you have free access to education.
Hmm.
Um, Corporations are taxed at 40%. That money's used to repair the
Hmm.
environment. Like, we understand that you're not happy, but that doesn't mean there's a global conspiracy to control you. Which,
Right.
you know,
Sure.
Yeah. So.
hmm Yeah, it's all too common that when people don't understand something or don't like something, they automatically assume that it's rigged against them.
Exactly.
Very
Exactly.
problematic. Yeah.
Yes. Very, very problematic. Yes.
Cool. All right. So you're through an independent press, or are you self-published?
So I'm self-published through
Okay.
Amazon.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay.
But if
Cool.
there's an independent press that would like to talk, I mean, by all means.
All ears. Yeah. I've gotten all kinds of responses to that. Some people are like, no, I'm self-publishing. I want the freedom. I'll do it all myself. I want to publish it when I want. Keep your hands off my stuff, which I
Yeah.
totally understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a
Totally. Yeah.
lot more work with marketing. Yeah. So is there any advice that you might have for authors who are considering this route of self-publication?
Yeah. So, first and foremost, don't give up. If you put your fingers to a keypad in any sort of constructive way of telling a story, I feel that you're a writer.
hmm
You're just a writer that's in the process of developing. The
hmm
biggest barrier to writing is quitting. Because when you
mm
quit, then you're not writing. When you're
Yeah.
writing, you're creating opportunities to, you know, put work out there that can be studied and evaluated and improved on.
hmm
And the second is, and I tell everyone that asks me this question, you got to grow a thick skin. Look
mm
for criticism.
hmm
I had a professor in college who, I mean, this professor destroyed all of my writing, but gave me precise criticism at every step.
Yeah.
And so it was a trial by fire in a manner of speaking, but it made me a better writer and
hmm
also just a better communicator. Because at the end of the
hmm
day, if you say something, you're responsible for what you've said,
hmm
because you constructed it.
hmm Yeah. I think
Yeah.
I've always thought that the worst and most demoralizing commentary a professor could give in a paper is just writing on it B plus, good job, and then no comments at all. That's just,
Yes.
I'm going to give this back to you. I don't want to deal with it. And yeah,
Yes. And inversely, the best that I've ever seen is a litany of arguments followed by an 80% well done, right? Like this
Mhm.
premise, your conclusion on this premise is somewhat debatable. Like,
Mhm.
well, I understand the interpretation of these facts, but then that final, like, you did a good job, I just don't agree,
Mhm.
validates your prowess as a writer because you were able
Mhm.
to provide something that someone was actually able to digest and disagree with.
Yeah.
At the same time, if the person goes, I didn't understand what you were writing, that's a much larger problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. It's not one that can't be remedied, but it is a bigger problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and then my last bit of advice is just make connections.
hmm
Humble thyself and make connections,
hmm
to be
Yeah.
honest.
Cool.
So,
All right. Hey, Kitty.
sorry, I have a cat. Yeah,
No, that's
she
fine.
wants to join the interview.
Yeah. I have to shut my cat out. Otherwise, he'd be crawling in front of the computer the whole time. But anyway, so hey, Raphael, thanks so much for your time. It's been wonderful
Thank
talking
you.
with you. Yeah, I loved your
Yes,
book,
yes.
and yeah, I'm looking forward to. Do you have a title for the cyberpunk comedy, or is it that's still in process?
So I'm thinking something along the lines of Tales of the Cyber Kid, a cyberpunk
Okay,
story.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
So,
I'll
and
be
we'll
on.
see. Hopefully, it's been a blast. I've been laughing the entire writing. I've just been cracking up. So
That's
I have
awesome.
guests here, and they're like, "What are you laughing at?" So yeah, it's we'll see what happens.
Cool. All right, man. Yeah, once again, been great talking to you, and I
Thank
wish
you
you
very
all
much.
the success as an author, as a creator, and in everything else you do.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
All right. Bye.